Možemo da počnemo. Dobar dan, dobrodošli na tribinu Centra za religijski studij Instituta za filozofiju i društvenu teoriju. Danas mi je posebna čast da najavim profesora Roberta Hajdena. Reći ću par reči o njemu. On je profesor antropologije, prava, javnih politika i međunarodnih poslova na Univerzitetu u Pittsburghu, gde je i direktor Centra za ruske i istočnoevropske studije. Dr. Hajden se bavi istraživanjima u oblasti bivše Jugoslavije i Indije, a od 2007. godine je vođa tima multidisciplinarne i međunarodne grupe istraživača koji su okupljeni oko projekta Antagonistička tolerancija, kompetitivno deljenje religijskih mesta, nezgodno je prevesti. Nedavno je objavio i monografiju From Yugoslavia to the Western Balkans, Studies of a European Disunion. I danas ćemo vam govoriti na temu antagonističke tolerancije. Profesor, izvolite.
Hvala Tijana. Jeste nezgodno prevediti. Onda sam bio u dilemi da li da pričam na srpskom ili na engleskom. I na kraju sam odlučio, izvinite, za engleski, zato što uopšte ne znam terminologiju i ja radim ovo sve na engleskom, ali možemo da vodimo raspravu na srpskom, odnosno na engleskom. Mogu mnogo preciznije da govorim na engleskom, ako me dozvolite.
U redu, nije problem.
Dobro, okay. So as Tiana said, this has been a very multidisciplinary and international project, and as you can see, the list of my main collaborators or co-conspirators. We've got a couple of Americans, a couple of Turks, we have a Peruvian, we have a Mexican, we have a Serb, and we have someone from India, and we've brought everybody together in different parts of the research. We've had people doing research in the areas in which they're expert, but bringing other people into these areas, and we've had workshops, including one in Belgrade 2 years ago, in which we brought everybody together to talk about the work that we are doing in this project that we call Antagonistic Tolerance. So let me get into that with some material that should be pretty well known to people here. Sarajevo, 21 years ago, when the war began, some of the pictures that went out to the world were of the large mosque and the large new Serbian Orthodox church and the Catholic cathedral and the synagogue, all very close to each other. And as you can see on this, what would we do without Google Earth? And these were pictures of sent out as evidence of the tradition of tolerance in Bosnia and Herzegovina, that they could all be so close together and all get along so well, and just another way to look at this. But there is another way to look at this, and an alternative view. This is from Ivo Andrić. I found the original and prepared a slide, but the formatting didn't work. All the words ran together, so I have to give it to you in English. But look particularly at the second paragraph, because it refers to the clocks and the churches. And if you read the original, Andrić is very specific. As people lie awake at night, they are bothered by the fact that the bells ring at different times and that the clocks keep different time, with the Catholic clock, the cathedral going to Austrian time, and the Serbian one going to Serbian time, and the Ottoman one going to a different time frame. And so it's a different way to look at it. Of course, the image that Andrić creates in the piece from 1920, that Bosnia is a land of hatred, is as much a distortion as the idea that everybody got along with each other very famously. But if we go to the history of these buildings, there is something here. Because in the Ottoman Empire, it was not possible to build churches or synagogues. You could technically repair them. The large Orthodox church was actually constructed between 1868 and 1872. And when it was constructed, it was very much against the wish of the majority of the people in Sarajevo. In fact, when the church was opened in 1872, 1,200 soldiers were positioned around the city with artillery trained on Baščaršija in case that there was a riot caused by the protests of the Muslim population against the creation of a large Christian church. They were particularly upset about the bell tower. That bothered them enormously. So the Christian church, the first Christian church, was the Orthodox Church. When it was built in the face of enormous opposition from the Muslim population. It was hardly greeted with open arms. The Catholic Church came up in the 1880s, the synagogues in the 1890s and the 1930s. So if you look at the history of these buildings, it looks like the greatest periods of tolerance in Bosnian history were the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, neither generally regarded as exactly liberal democracies. So something else was going on here. What was going on was that just as the Ottomans had prohibited the construction of churches, and particularly of bell towers, when they let something be built, it had to be low. One of the standards in Ottoman law was that a church had to be lower than the vision of a Turk on a horse. One of my favorites is in Skopje, where in order to make the church big enough, they dug. They had to dig down into the ground, so the church is half underground. So the building of the large churches was actually a powerful statement to the Muslim population and to the Ottoman rulers that, in fact, they were no longer dominant. And this is what actually Andrich is getting into here. And this is what led in part to the project that we developed, that's why that doesn't work, of antagonistic tolerance. We wanted to develop a model that would deal with the situations, and they're very common in the world, situations in which you have peoples living together, peoples who identify themselves as self and other, largely on a religious criteria, and who live intermingled for many, many years, potentially many, many generations, not often intermarrying or not officially intermarrying. And of course, if you wanted to get a riot started in Austro-Hungarian, Bosnia and Herzegovina, stage an intermarriage. And it would get people on the street and bring violence. How would these people get along with each other? Well, it turns out that these kinds of situations are very common, and they develop very peacefully as long as it's clear which group is dominant. And dominance is indicated by control over key religious sites. I'm not going to show them today, but you can think of this conquest of Constantinople. Immediately, Mehmet converts Hagia Sophia from the largest church in Christendom to the largest mosque in the world. But if you, a couple hundred years earlier, Cordoba, the great mosque of Cordoba, becomes the heart of the cathedral of Cordoba. So this is a type of transformation that is pretty common in the world, and that's what we decided to look at, is how these religious buildings could be seen as marking periods of dominance, changes in dominance. But when dominance is clear, one of the interesting things about it is that there's a great deal of sharing. There's a great deal of, if you wish, syncretism, multiculturalism, as long as it's clear which group is dominant. When dominance is threatened, you get violence. When dominance changes, then you can get the changes in the structure of the religious buildings. So let me start in Bulgaria. A nice place on the outskirts of Bulgaria, now called Knjaževo until 1878. It was called Teketo, Tekia, and where you now see the church. There was a Teke. Is there a? Yeah, there's an arrow here. And actually the Teke is still there right behind the church. It is a church of St. Ilya, which is kind of interesting because it turns out that Muslims in the Balkans do not have problems with Old Testament saints. And at this church to St. Ilya, you can see that the praznik is 20. Juli. On that day, by the new calendar, Christians come to celebrate the Slava of St. Ilya. On that day, by the old calendar, Muslims come to the church to celebrate St. Ilya. But the main attraction here is the turbe in the back. the tomb in the back, the tomb of Bali Effendi. Bali Effendi, a rather minor Balkan saint, pretty localized actually, but he has his importance, and this is his tomb, his turbe. And as often happens when you have large turbes like this, the person buried there is treated as a saint. People will come and ask for blessings, often specific kinds of blessings, for good fortune of different types, good fortune in business or in marriage. For some of them, which we'll see later, women come who wish to get pregnant, and others come who wish to be cured of various ailments. They'll come and they'll leave offerings. Now, this actually says, you can't see it because it's rolled over, but it says, do not light candles. Pray to Allah. And it was put there by the Muftiluk, the religious authority in Bulgaria that for the Muslims, which is very much Orthodox Sunni. And Sunni Islam, Orthodox Sunni Islam, has real problems with saints. They shouldn't exist. It's like Protestant Christianity. And also has real problems with people lighting candles if they're going to pray to saints, because they regard that as a Christian practice. They're also not too pleased when Christians show up at some of these sites, as they do. So they mark this, don't light candles, pray to Allah. But of course, what do you see? Is that people are constantly lighting candles. Now, this turns out to be very common at saints' sites in Bulgaria and in Macedonia and in Turkey and in Greece. Both Muslims and Muslims and Christians, it's my Indian side, Muslims and Christians will come and they will light candles. Usually, the Christians light beeswax candles, and the Muslims light white or green paraffin candles. These, of course, are the beeswax. Now, that may be because everybody was getting them at the church, which is right in front of the turbe. But it's a nice little display to me of a kind of sharing of practices. And we know that Christians come to this as well as Muslims. Of course, there's also the opposition of the Orthodox religious hierarchy, which isn't very happy about it. I would imagine the priests are not absolutely pleased about it either, but we didn't get to talk to them. We did only minimal field work here. Well, that's present day, but you get trajectories that last a long time. We're all familiar with the Parthenon, of course, the eternal temple to the goddess Athena. And yet the Parthenon spent more centuries as a church to Mary Theotokos, the birth giver of God, than it did as a temple to the goddess Athena. The Roman, conversion into a Roman temple, but then from a Roman temple into a Christian Church of Mary. But then, of course, it was converted into a mosque and spent a number of centuries as a mosque, actually as many centuries almost as a mosque as it did as a church, both more than it did as a temple to Athena. This is actually a contemporary illustration. The Parthenon was blown up in the Venetian siege because there was gunpowder stored in it, and that's why it's the wrecked structure that we see now. But even afterwards, till the end of Ottoman rule, the Parthenon was marked with a mosque. This is actually a drawing from one of the very earliest photographs ever taken. It's an 1842 daguerreotype, and you can see this small mosque in the middle. You can see it marked there. Of course, what's going on? Well, in Athens, Athens is dominated by the Acropolis. The Acropolis is dominated by the Parthenon. It is the most important site visually and religiously in Athens for more than 3,000 years. And so that is the site where the religious institutions were placed and have continued to be placed. Now, of course, the Parthenon is treated by the Greeks as very much a temple to Athena, the eternal temple to Athena. And in fact, even Greek archaeologists take the position that everything that happened to it from the arrival of the Romans until the departure of the Ottomans was bad. That it would have been better, I've seen Greek archaeologists say it would have been better if it had been left to the elements, because everything else was a destruction of the eternal character of the building, which is the way these things are often looked at, but is very misleading. If you go to the Parthenon now, they'll tell you grudgingly a little bit about the history of it as a church, but not as a mosque. There's not actually that much known about it. There are only a few articles on it. Well, we wanted to deal with this, and we came up with how do we link then religious structures to populations? And we came up with the concept of religioscape. And now you can see why I didn't want to try to translate this. Referring to the distribution in spaces through time of the physical manifestations of specific religious traditions and of the population that build them. You have to have both the people and the buildings to have a religioscape as we use it. So it's a social space marked by physical icons, from small shrines to large complexes of them, or even sacred cities. And this is important as well. Usually when people work on sacred sites, they work on an individual site, the Parthenon, or Hagia Sophia, or the great Cathedral of Cordoba. But actually, it's best to look at any one site in the context of other sites associated with the same religion or with other religions, potentially in competition with them. If you do that, then the placement of the particular sites and the physical features of the particular sites became extremely interesting. And that's what we refer to in the end here, displayed by the features of sites relative to each other. Well, what do we mean by features? Let me start. This is the only time I'll get out of Europe in this presentation. In the larger project, we have fabulous material from Peru. And we've got some good stuff from Mexico, and we've got a lot of stuff from India, but this just happens to be close to my heart. This is a site that I happen to have been in 1976, but didn't take the picture. It's a tomb of a saint, which in 1976 looked for all the world like the tomb of a Muslim saint. Look at the architecture with these onion-shaped domes that are directly descended from Muslim architecture, Central Asia, and come down through the Taj Mahal and the like. And the color of this, it's a very faded photograph. This is probably a green. It comes out blue here. And when I was there in 1976, it was very much of a Muslim tomb. It was a Bismillah next to the tomb itself, which was covered with a green cloth with writing in Arabic. But there were Hindu priests as well. There were both Muslim religious functionaries and Hindu priests. Both Hindus and Muslims came, but it looked primarily like a Muslim site that Hindus also came to. Well, in the 1980s and the 1990s, the site was changed. There came a day in 1990 when Hindu fundamentalists, if you wish, invaded the place and transformed it physically. Not the buildings. The buildings remain the same structures, but the color. This is very much the color of Hinduism. And if you would go into the shrine, the green cloth had been removed, replaced with a saffron-colored cloth, the color of Hinduism. The Bismillah was gone, and Sanskrit shlokas had replaced it. But still, both Hindus and Muslims came to it. And that was the last time I'd seen it, in 1992, when I took that picture, until March of this year, when I went back. And I went back precisely because I'd heard some of these things but couldn't believe it. Look at this change. You have what had been a very Muslim-inspired architecture just replaced completely by something that is totally Hindu. And the color schemes also changing. This is a Hindu color, but this is contemporary Hinduism, is very bright, very noticeable. And in spending 2 days at the shrine this March, I was fascinated. It is completely, totally Hinduized. There is no Muslim presence of any kind at this site. Muslims still come, but they no longer have religious functionaries, and they can no longer pray as Muslims at this site. Now, all of this was done quite peacefully with the occasional riot, but we trace it to the political control of the region, which went from being a Muslim kingdom at the time that it was built through the periods of British rule, when the British balanced both the Muslims and the Hindus. They were primarily interested in keeping peace. Hindus started to acquire rights to it, to acquire the ability to go and perform their religious ceremonies and the like. Independent India is a secular state, but it's a secular state with an overwhelming majority of Hindus. And right-wing Hindu religious parties have had enormous influence on Indian political life. And so now this is an area in which Hindus rule. It may be a secular state, but Hindus rule, and the transformation of the shrine has taken this form. This is completely Hindu. If I go back to one, that'll go back, yeah. Just a fine detail, you'll notice a kind of modified Muslim crescent here, slightly third spike in the middle, which would make it the trident, the Trishul of Lord Shiva. But it's a very mixed symbol here. Not here. Here, this is completely the trident of Lord Shiva. It's completely a Hindu symbol as it is there. So these are transformations that are taking place at the present day in contemporary societies, even contemporary democratic societies, even contemporary secular states, which I find interesting, and not exclusively in Asia, because we see this in some parts of Europe as well. But what types of changes are we looking for? Well, we're looking for indicators of dominance. What are indicators of dominance? A graduate student of mine took this photograph in northern Cyprus. It's one of the few places in northern Cyprus where you still have Greek Christians, 19th century church, a very new mosque. Note which is higher. This becomes important. When you look for indicators of dominance, we look for perceptibility. Perceptibility, features that make religious sites more noticeable. Superior height relative to other nearby structures. Size, sheer monumentality, ornateness, color. Audibility, what do we mean by audibility? A minaret is a technology for broadcasting sound, and so is a bell tower. Now they also add height, which can make them visible, but at heart and originally they are sound broadcasting systems. Some of these come into play rather nicely on two quite nearly contemporary buildings. The Emperor's Mosque in Sarajevo, which is large, high, has very good audibility, and is quite ornate. Whereas the old Serbian Orthodox Church didn't have the bell tower. The bell tower comes in 1881. The Ottomans leave in 1878. The bell tower comes in 1881. There's a great deal of protest against that, too. In fact, originally the demand is, okay, let the Christians have their tower, but they can't have bells in it. And then, okay, they can put a bell in it, but they can't ring the bell. And then the Austrians, what are you talking about, right? And they do it. But note that it's plain, it's low, and it's small. Now, of course, the new church that was constructed from 1868 to 1872 was large, ornate, high, and had a bell tower, which is why it was objected to, as do the other buildings. So we have perceptibility, height, audibility, ornateness. Centrality is, I just like the visual here, it happens to be from Peru, but centrality is another feature. Centrality of what? Centrality in regards to a settlement. In principle, we found a religious building that is close to the center of a settlement is usually that of the dominant religious group. This happens in Plovdiv, Bulgaria, and this is the heart of Old Plovdiv. The market mosque was here, but it was right on the site of the Roman amphitheater. This is the oldest part of Plovdiv. And the mosque actually replaced a large Christian church that was there when the city was conquered. But if you go up this hill here, it's interesting. You go up Saborska ulica and you get to a fairly large church, which was built in the 1840s. After 1839, it is possible to build churches in the Ottoman Empire. The Tanzimat reforms permitted building churches, but it's after 1839. Immediately, the Bulgarians, among others, start building them, but it was not permitted to have a bell tower. It had to be fairly low, it had to be fairly plain, and it couldn't have a bell tower. Bulgarians get independence in 1878, and 2 years later, they put on this marvelously incongruous bell tower, which gives them an advantage of height. Now, they were higher up, but they were off the center. But when the church was built, if you looked back towards the center, there's the minaret. And until 1928, the minaret was about up here. So the minaret would still have been higher even than the church. So you're getting this competitive features of visibility, of height, and the like, that play out in the construction of buildings like this. And centrality and perceptibility can play off against each other, as we put it here. And the conclusion is that assuming equal centrality, greater perceptibility indicates dominance. How might this play out? Again, in Bulgaria, Suvarovo, town in eastern Bulgaria, not too far from Varna, absolutely flat. You have a 16th century mosque, you have a mid-19th century church. This is the administrative center of the town. Neither is higher than the other. This one is a little closer in, but they're pretty close to each other. There was no one place where I could get pictures of them, but you could see them. Now, as I say, it's a 16th century mosque and a 19th century church. It's a Tanzimat church, a late Tanzimat church. Now, when they built the church, it wound up that they did have a bell tower, but the roof of the mosque was higher than the roof of the church, but the bell tower of the church was higher than the roof of the mosque, but the minaret of the mosque was higher than the bell tower of the church. But if you look on top of the minaret, you have a cross. I hope you will trust me that finding a cross on top of a minaret of a working mosque is unusual. And ask people why that is. There are two stories. And one of them from the Muslims is that, well, when our ancestors were building the mosque, they got some money from the Pasha to do it, but it wasn't enough money. They could build the mosque, they couldn't build the minaret, but they couldn't go back to the Pasha and say, we need more money, we couldn't do it. I mean, that would have fatal consequences. So they went to their Christian neighbors and said, help us. And the Christians said, sure, but you have to put a cross on top of your minaret. So that's the story the Muslims tell. The Christians, on the other hand, say, oh yeah, right. Said they kept building their minaret and it kept collapsing. And so our ancestors told them that if they put a cross on top of the minaret, it would stand up, and they did, and it did, and the cross and the minaret are still there for that reason. Now, I have heard variations of that story, the collapsing minaret or the collapsing tower story, from South India through Bosnia. It's a standard type. What's fascinating about it is that when you actually look at it closely, it's not a cross. It's a fleur-de-lis, which is a somewhat ambiguous symbol in this part of the world. But what's particularly fascinating about it is everybody must know this, but everybody acknowledges that it's a cross. Because in Bulgaria is very much of a state in which Bulgarian Orthodox Christians rule. And it may be a secular state, and it may be a member of the European Union, but it's a state in which Bulgarian Orthodox Christians rule, except in a couple of parts of it, which I don't think I get into in this one. And so it's worthwhile to everybody to acknowledge that, even when it's not necessarily so. Now, you can do this through historical trajectories. This happens to be the development of Bursa, the first Ottoman capital, a Greek town of Brusa, until it's conquered in 1326. And they start building mosques, and what I like about this is a Japanese and a Turkish archaeology team did some studies on what the sightlines would have been, and were arguing that the placement of the mosques was done to increase the visibility of the mosques to the population, which was almost entirely Christian. And they even straightened some of the roads to improve the sightlines, which is kind of intriguing. At the same time, the Ottomans were taking over the primary Christian buildings. Osman, the founder of the dynasty, died before they took Bursa, but he had looked at Bursa and said he wanted to be buried in the silver building, in this, and it was a chapel in a Christian monastery, which becomes Osman's mausoleum, and Orhan's mausoleum is right next to it. It's in the same complex. It was the primary Christian complex of Greek Brusa, which the buildings become appropriated and turned into the tombs of the emperors. Now, I have heard that between 1920 and 1922, when Bursa again, Bursa was the capital of the Greek invasion force, that the Greeks actually turned Osman's tomb into a pig pen, which would be kind of interesting. But that's only out of one source, since we haven't been able to document it. It would be perfectly logical. The Greeks did take over other mosques. In fact, we just found last year some stencils of Greek flags in a mosque in Bursa that had been covered over since 1923. So you have then the construction to increase visibility. You have the appropriation and transformation of the buildings of the group that is now being subordinated. It is now put into a subordinate position by the dominating group. Elsewhere in Turkey, Trilya, not too far from Bursa, a major Greek town until 1923, with 5 large Greek Orthodox churches. This one, the largest, the St. Stephen Church, a 5th century church, converted in the 14th century into a mosque, really for symbolic reasons. There were no Muslims living in the town, and the Ottomans moved several Muslim families into it after they had converted the main church into a mosque, but it never had a large Muslim population until 1923. The humanitarian exchange of populations, as Dobrotić would have called it, that resulted in the departure of all Christians, virtually, Greek Christians at least, from most of Anatolia. The other 4 churches remained in full function until 1923, and you can still visit them. There's not much left of them, and these are some of the ones in better shape. But they serve no purpose. There's no Christian population. They don't have to be converted. There's nobody there to impress. Christians will still come. The descendants of people from the town will come to these places and look at them, but there's not much that they can do. Turkey, of course, is also a secular state, nominally. Centrality can change, which makes some of the same images. If you go to Sofia, Bulgaria, there's this very strange church in the middle of a large intersection. It's kind of weird. You drive by this, and it's a very small church with larger ones behind it. And what is this? This is the Church of St. Petka. Actually, this church of St. Petka was the first church in Sofia. It's supposedly one of the first Christian churches in the Balkans. The legend is that Constantine himself consecrated it. It's not far from Serdica to Nisus, so it's not completely implausible. But this is the Roman town. And where you see the small church now was the Roman temple that, with the conversion of the empire to Christianity, did become a Christian church. But as the city expanded, it expanded out and up a hill, and so that even in the Roman period, you had the development of a large church of St. Sophia, after which the city becomes named. The Roman Serdica becomes Sofia, and that is still out there, and in a very prominent position. You can see the prominence of it in 1879. This is the Church of St. Sophia. It was visible from all over the city. Now, you can also see this is not a smokestack, this is a minaret. It was converted into a mosque. The St. Petka Church was never converted, but by that stage it was small, it was low, it was unimportant. There was no point in manifesting dominance, and you let the subordinated people continue to have some of their own institutions so long as they are subordinated in position. So now, of course, immediately after independence, this is restored, and if you go there today, this is what you'll see, and it's actually a quite impressive, basically 8th century church with the remnants of earlier churches beneath it and inside it. But Sofia was full of mosques. This is, if you're familiar with Sofia, this is Graf Ignatiev, and the main market is over here. And you've got the Kara Jami, the black mosque in the background in 1879, immediately after the liberation of Bulgaria, as the Bulgarians put it. Here's the Kara Jami, the black mosque, and here it is now. the Church of the 40 Mitres. They did such a fine job of converting it that it's very difficult to tell that it was actually started out as a mosque. Unless you look at a very good map, or if you have a compass, it's oriented to the southeast. Orthodox churches go due east. This is oriented to the southeast because that way is Mecca. So it was set up in that way. And there's several other places in Bulgaria where you see this. I like this 16th century mosque in a place called Uzunjovo, which is near Haskovo. It's actually closer to Edirne. It's actually almost on the border between Turkey and modern Turkey and modern Bulgaria. Unimportant place now. It used to be a very important, one of the most important markets in the Balkans, and this was the market mosque, and really marks the entrance into a Christianized territory. Moving on, religioscapes can move as things happen. Banknote from 1997 in Cyprus. Cyprus. When it was a British colony, it had a quite mixed population of Turks and Greeks and a few others, and you can say see the population distribution. Of course, these are the types of maps we all saw in the 1990s from Bosnia. Cyprus never worked. The Cypriot state that was proclaimed independent against the wishes of the Turkish population in 1960 never functioned. Was in a state of permanent crisis. Most of the Turks herded into essentially concentration camps by the Greeks in the 1960s, leading ultimately to the Turkish invasion to protect the Turkish population, which led to the partitioning of the island and what you might wish to call a population exchange, or you might wish to call a mutual ethnic cleansing. It's the same process. So if you go there now, there are almost no Greeks in the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. There are virtually no Turks in Greek Cyprus. There are a few Greeks way out here. That's where that other picture was, and that's what you have. And of course, you can see the population distribution is radically different from what it was earlier. Which means you've got a lot of remnants of the Greeks up in here, and in fact, you do. And as you drive through the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, in many, many towns, you'll see an Orthodox church, has to have been built in the 19th century or later, and they will always have a new mosque next to them, unless they were converted. And if you go into the Orthodox church itself, if it wasn't converted into a mosque, it's been left to decay, as you can see. We don't regard this as marking a religioscape because there aren't any Greeks. You could see it as an archaeoscape, but not as a religioscape. The mosque is one. Some churches were converted into mosques. Tuzla. There was a neighborhood in Larnaca called Tuzla, which was a Turkish neighborhood. They all moved up to Enkomi, driving the Greeks out of Enkomi, and converted this amazing 19th century church into a 20th and 21st century mosque. Mecca, of course, is this way. It's almost due south. You're this far over. Almost, but not quite due south. These lines mark the direction of Mecca for praying. The mihrab is over here. The altar, of course, would have been here to the east. And so that's what you see in northern Cyprus. You could see similar things in southern Cyprus. So actually, the Greeks tore down most of the mosques. They just blew them up and tore them down. There's not too much to see. The Turks let them stay more. Or some of the major sites, again in northern Cyprus, the most important site in northern Cyprus, the Church of St Barnabas, the monastery of St Barnabas, was simply turned into a museum. This says Turist Autobus. It's a tourist bus. And you go there as a tourist and you pay money to enter the monastery, which is a museum. And it's an icon museum. There were icons taken from churches all over northern Cyprus. And you go in there and they're displayed, and they're not particularly explained, but it doesn't have any of the church features. There are icons, but no iconostasis. There's no altar, there's nothing. And it's a museum. You pay to go in. On the other hand, if you then turn around, put your back to the monastery and walk 100 meters, you can go into the tomb of St. Barnabas. Now this is in northern Cyprus, and it's interesting because it's a working Orthodox Christian site. And that's fascinating because, by definition, there are no Orthodox Christians living in northern Cyprus. They live in southern Cyprus. They can cross the line now. As of 2003, crossing the green line in Cyprus is easier than crossing from the United States into Canada, or from Serbia into Croatia. But it's interesting because Christians are coming up and taking care of this site, which is being used by both Muslims and Christians, looking for blessings. This is a image of a baby. And so a woman who wants to get pregnant has made this offering here. You see these types of things. You can find ears, you can find hands, you can find legs at this type of saints. So we do regard this as part of a Greek religioscape, a little bit on the other side. They've managed to establish it. If you go to Mortefu, northern Cyprus, way over in the West End, you find the St. Mamas Church Museum, and it's fascinating because if you walk into this, you have your iconostasis. You go behind the iconostasis. You have the altar cloth, you've got all of the silver, you've got everything. It's a fully equipped Orthodox church. And when I was there with a graduate student of mine who was Turkish, I told her in English, my God, it looks like a priest could come and do a liturgy tomorrow. And the Turkish woman working for the museum who was keeping the place immediately said, oh, the bishop does. The bishop of Mortefu comes here once or twice a year with Greeks from the south. Now, he can't live there. He has to live in South Cyprus. And it's still a museum, but they let him come up and do this. Well, we see this as a manifestation of the acceptance by all parties of the division. That, in fact, the dominance of the Turks to the north is not threatened. The Greeks know it's not threatened, that they can't threaten it. So the Greeks are able to use some of this, but it remains under the control of the Turks. And we actually see this as a good sign for the stability of Cyprus, that the division has now been accepted to the point where the Greeks say, okay, so it's a museum, so what? But if we can go and hold a liturgy there twice a year, that's fine with us, if it's a church the rest of the time. So the structures of the domination are actually reinforced by this. It's a demonstration that, yeah, we'll let you do this, but we're still in control. And that actually is a sign of stability. The tomb of St. Mamas is there, and both Turks, as Muslims and Greek Christians come, asking to get pregnant, asking to have their hearing restored. There's actually a Barbie doll leg up here for somebody who's lame. Note this little Anatolian eye is more associated with Turks than with Greeks in Cyprus, and in fact in most of the region. And so you come and you make offerings to St. Mamas, and both Christians and Muslims do that. Overwhelmingly Christian iconography, literally, but Muslims are still able to do it. Not that the Muftirluk is very happy about it. They're not, but they can pretend it's a Christian site and that Muslims should not be going there. Coexistence, Cyprus had a lot of it. When Cyprus was applying to get into the European Union and they wanted to demonstrate how tolerant and multicultural they were, they issued this banknote. And this place exists, Peristerana. If you look at it, it looks like in the banknote that the tower of the church is a little higher than the minaret. Here they look about equal. That's actually an illusion for a couple of reasons. But I stole this illustration shamelessly from a colleague in Cyprus who was using it in a talk. And when he gave the talk, a woman in the audience stood up and said, oh yeah, she used to work in the Central Bank of Cyprus, and they had a terrible problem with these banknotes because they were only used in Greek Cyprus. And people would scratch out the minaret. They didn't want to see it. But anyway, so it looks as if it's all fairly equal, but that's an illusion because actually, if you approach the town from the main road, here's the minaret, and here's the tower, and it's clear which one is higher. And they've hidden that, you see, in this nice picture. If you go to this mosque now, it's fairly impressive, but it's derelict, it's boarded up, it's deserted, and there's graffiti. Kemal Ataturk was gay, Cyprus is Greek. This is tolerance in the European Union, folks. So that's what you get. But you're getting these manifestations then of dominance. I'm going to get near the end. I'm going to wind up with Belgrade before I do a couple of other things. Sometimes it's useful to fake commemoration of formerly shared spaces. Portugal and Spain have until recently been very proud of the fact that there haven't been Jews in either since about 1492. They drove out the Jews and the Muslims. But in recent years, in order to for basically get Israeli tourists, American Jewish tourists, and for foreign policy reasons, they decided to promote their Muslim heritage. And so they are marking the Juderia, the Jewish area. This happens to be a town in central Portugal called Castilla de León, and they make a big display out of this. And they have the synagogue, which is a museum. And when you go through it, I mean, they'll tell you all about the Jewish community. And it was done with the highest support of the state, so that the president of Portugal comes and apologizes to the Jewish population in 1989. And you have this museum and all this commemoration. But it's fascinating, because if you go through the museum, when you get to the very end, there's a sign that says, by the archaeologist who did it, he said, well, actually, we don't really have evidence that this building was the synagogue. But there had to have been a synagogue. And this might have been it. I don't know too many archaeologists who like going out on a limb like that and say, we don't have evidence for this, but we're going to say it's this even if we don't think it is this. But that's exactly what they're doing. But what they're doing is creating not a religioscape. There still aren't particularly Jews in Portugal. They don't live there. It's an archaeoscape. It's something for tourists. It's something for commemoration. It's something symbolic, but it's not a real religious site. On the other hand, there are Muslims in Portugal and in the European Union. There were morarias, the places where the ghettos where the Muslims were confined after the Reconquest, and they're not particularly commemorated. It's just the street sign says, you know, the street of the Moraria. This is in a place called Moor, and it's one of the better preserved Morarias. But it has a tiny little museum that's one room, and there must have been a mosque, but they're not going to commemorate it. Muslims are not popular in Portugal. They're not popular in the European Union, and so they'll kind of say, yeah, they were there, but you know, we're not going to celebrate it, even though there are some there. So this difference in handling is kind of interesting. The one building in Portugal that was built as a mosque in the 12th century is still standing, became a church, is still a church. You can see the mihrab. They've recently uncovered it behind an altar, but it's very much of a church, and Muslims cannot pray here. They've asked and are not permitted to do that. So again, it's an archaeoscape. It's not a working religioscape. All right. Well, let's wind up with Belgrade. I loved this sign that it used to be on Kalemegdan for a few years. And the thing I love about it is that you've got all these names from Singidunum to Belgrade, but the Turkish name of the city is not given. You've got Hungarian, you've got German, you've got all sorts of things, but you don't have the Turkish name of the town. Why? It was a Turkish town for 500 years. That's no longer there. Well, if you look at Belgrade before it became a Turkish town, I mean, we've all seen this one, and then the Turks besieged the place. Then the Turks take it, and when they took it, they immediately, of course, converted the main church, which was halfway down the hill. They immediately converted that into a mosque. They converted or destroyed the remaining churches in Belgrade, converted them into mosques or destroyed them. And then you have periods of backwards and forth. When the Turks take the place, they tear down the mosques, the churches, and turn them into mosques. When the Hungarians take it, they tear down the mosques or convert them into churches. The Turks take it back and everything goes back into being mosques. Then the Austrians take it and they turn things into churches or tear them down, mosques into churches. The Bayraklia was briefly a Catholic church. This picture from 1879 is not very well reproduced here, but what I find interesting is the number of minarets, not all of which are in great shape. Belgrade was full of mosques, and the Austrians had targeted them, but of course they lost out, and the Ottoman Empire took Belgrade once again and held it. And you know, there are pictures of mosques from the Ottoman period, the Turbe Mosque in Belgrade. And then you have the first Serbian uprising, right? Rather romantic viewpoint of this. What do you think happens when Karađorđe takes Belgrade in 1806? Here's what happens. So it's a very common story. It's the most common story. The conversion of one of the largest buildings into one of the largest mosques into an Orthodox church. The appropriation and reuse or destruction of most of the other mosques, leaving one for the Muslim population still to use. And of course, this last one, Karađorđe loses Belgrade, and it goes back to Turkish control. But by the 1840s, this is also a well-known picture that I'm sure you've seen. What I find interesting about this is clearly Saborna Crkva, which goes up in 1837. Look at the numbers of mosques and the numbers of them that are not in particularly good repair. This is, of course, during the period of the Principality, when Serbia is still nominally ruled both by a Serbian prince and by a representative of the Porte. But it's clear that the Ottoman influence, the Turkish influence, is in decline, and the prominence of the Saborna Crkva is really very striking in the Ottoman period. Just happens to be a picture of the oldest picture of a mosque I could find in Belgrade, near Sahat Kula. When the Turks finally left, of course, they have to leave a number of mosques, and so you have these pictures of Batal Jamia, which was a main one over by Skupština now. Kara Jamia, right below the Narodna pozorišta, and used as a building for supplying gas. Now, at the same time that the mosques are coming out of use, churches are built. The first church in Belgrade in the Ottoman period, 1835, Crkva Svetog Marka, the first one. 1835, this is before the Tanzimat. The Tanzimat, which makes it legal to build churches in the Ottoman Empire, doesn't come until 1839, so Serbia is ahead of the game on this. And they're building churches when they shouldn't have been. Now this becomes the pattern: plain church, no bell tower, fairly small, fairly low. But this is really extraordinary. I don't think you realize how extraordinary it is necessarily, because for the Ottomans to have permitted the creation of a fairly large church with a prominent bell tower in 1837 was really a quite staggering demonstration of the decline of Ottoman influence in Belgrade. This is an enormous assertion of power by the Serbs, just that they could create this and build it. And of course, the mosques are going out of use. By the time the Turks leave in 1867, there are only 7 mosques standing. They're all in disrepair, but the non-Turkish Muslims, the ancestors of today's Bosniaks, go to the new Serbian administration and say, we're Muslims, we're not Turks, we need a mosque. He gives them the smallest one then standing, Bayrakli. And they are permitted to use that. Interestingly, was it Miloš or Milan? It's about 1868. Wisely pays to repair the mosque, puts Muslim religious functionaries, imports them from Sarajevo, puts them on the Serbian state payroll, and pays for the upkeep of the mosque as a gesture to the Muslim population. But Bayrakli, if you look at it, it's relatively low down. It doesn't have a particularly prominent minaret, and of course by this stage, as the city grew, the city's grown around it. What I find interesting about this mosque now is that it's actually so hard to see. If you're walking down the street, you almost have to be on top of it to see it, even though it's got the minaret. So it's quite subordinated, and it's the oldest working mosque in Belgrade. Now there are some other Muslim religious structures that are still in use. Well, sorry, I wanted to compare with the prominence of the second Church of St. Mark, which is large, ornate, prominent, and we all know, you can hear the bells a long way. There are a few remaining other Muslim religious structures, and of course we all know this one, right, on Studenski Trg. It's actually treated as a saint's tomb. So if you go there and pay careful attention, it's probably women who are tying the knots as they're asking for prayers. I've had Turkish visitors who say, yeah, I mean, in Turkey at least, it would be the women who would be tying the knots like this. Men would be lighting candles. If you go to the turbe on Kale Megdan, you will find, not infrequently, white candles on the windows, or the stubs of white candles on the windows. And if you look inside, you can see that notes have been pushed under the door, people asking for blessings from a rather odd saint, if you look at his history. But so those things are still there, but who knows? Who knows about them? They're not, I mean, the one on Kale Megdan is, relatively prominent, but it's a minor thing in Kale Megdan. Nobody pays much attention to this one at all. And yet it's still in use, but it's subordinated. I couldn't resist the graffiti at this moment either. But it does say, "Eu ne hvala," and then somebody said, "Da molim," and then that was crossed out in 1389, put in. Finally, why do comparative work? Well, you do comparative work because it can lead you to some interesting things. I'm fairly confident that everybody in this room is thoroughly familiar with this building, and that almost nobody in this room is particularly familiar with this building. And Kocatepe in Ankara was conceptualized in the 1930s, at the same time as Fethi Sava. It was conceptualized to be the major mosque of the capital, but of the capital of a secular state. The Kingdom of Yugoslavia was nominally, at least, a secular state and a multi-religious state, and Ataturk's Turkey is a religious state as well, and they are conceptualized in the 1930s and built in the 1980s in what are still nominally secular states. This was built in Yugoslavia, not in well, it was in Serbia, obviously, but it was in Yugoslavia, and this is built in the Turkish Republic, the secular Turkish Republic. Of course, the design of them are both Hagia Sophia, as refracted by Sinan, is quite interesting. But you can actually learn quite a lot about the underlying importance of religious politics in secular states, and secular states that have at times had voting, if not exactly openly democratic systems. And yet it is in these secular states that these large buildings come up. Nobody has ever studied these. People who study Serbia don't study Turkey, and people who study Turkey don't study Serbia. We have some plans to do a little bit of work on the histories of these things. We have done a little bit, and they are really quite fascinatingly parallel in many ways. So by doing comparative work, we find ourselves going down interesting paths and seeing things that have not necessarily been much noticed before, and that we then comment on. And that's it. So I'm happy to take questions or comments in English ili na srpskom.